Ah, the golden age of television. That was something, wasn't it? The early 2010s were truly something, and in that golden age of TV, Hannibal was a real gem. It was bold, it was artistic, it was horrifying in a way that no other TV series even dared to try. This was a reimagining of Thomas Harris's iconic characters with an operatic flair. Bryan Fuller, the visionary showrunner, transformed the tale of Dr. Hannibal Lecter into something that explored the human psyche, violence, and of course, the beauty of it all. Well, we, the Fannibals, get it, really enjoyed the show. Sadly, the show came to an end right after 3 seasons. So, the question that has all of us Fannibals bothered was whatever happened to Hannibal? Let's go back to 2013. NBC, the network that was most popular for shows like The Office and Law & Order, suddenly greenlit a project with some very dark themes. This was a horror thriller show focusing on the procedural aspect of dealing with a psychiatrist who also happens to have a hankering for human meat. And it wasn't just any cannibal, mind you, this was the cannibal. It was Hannibal Lecter. We all know this cannibal from Anthony Hopkins' spine-chilling and Oscar-winning portrayal in The Silence of the Lambs. Lecter is a fictional character, so in a way, from a business standpoint, this was already a very profitable IP. But the thing was, NBC got Bryan Fuller on the show, and he wasn't just about to repackage The Silence of the Lambs for us. No, he wanted to take Thomas Harris's creation to the next level. He wanted to expand the grisly universe in the most art house operatic way possible. It had everything you could ever want from a primetime TV show. Nightmarish visuals? Check. Tons and tons of blood? Check. And some sort of longing? Check. Either way, it was very surprising that NBC was willing to take the risk, but somehow they did it, and we got Bryan Fuller for the show. So all in all, NBC got a very much not PG show. Now on paper, Hannibal was supposed to be just a procedural, but in reality it was way different. It was actually a surrealist horror thinly disguised as something lesser than that. It had dreamlike visuals, grotesquely gorgeous violence, and absolutely elevated dialogue. This show had no business being this surprising while airing next to America's Got Talent. We had a human cello, we had a mushroom garden on a human corpse, we had a tree growing out of someone's mouth. Overall, this was the kind of horror you'd expect from A24 Productions, not the network that gave us The Office or Minute to Win It. And this is where the whole problem starts. This show wasn't bad, it was brilliant, but it was brilliant in a way that confused a lot of people. People started watching the show in the hopes that they would see the FBI profiler catch the killer of the week, but instead, they saw the psychological chess matches, 2 men whispering threats over a man-made man meal, and philosophical tangents galore. And of course, who could forget all of those deliciously devilish montages of food? Before we get into the nitty-gritty of everything, let's talk about what made Hannibal so special and why it later became its downfall. The first person that we absolutely have to talk about when it comes to this topic is Bryan Fuller. He rose to fame because of his visual style, which can be described as odd, but in the best way possible. Dead Like Me and Pushing Daisies are beautiful examples of his work, which if you haven't checked out, you 100% should. So, with that kind of background, he decided to bring Hannibal to life with his signature style, but with the horror and darkness amped up to 11. In his words, he envisioned the show as a slow-burning love story. Any guesses on who the lovers were supposed to be? We'll give you a minute. Yup, that's right. It's between Will and Hannibal. And if you thought those gay undertones were your imagination, they weren't. And I mean, the love story kind of makes sense, doesn't it? It's between a psychiatrist who wants to break the forensic profiler, who has so much empathy that it breaks him. The love story is simply perfect. Their relationship isn't central to the show. No, their relationship is the entire show. This twisted love story cosplays as a crime drama, and for 3 seasons, Fuller managed to pull it off. And the reason he pulled it off so well was because of how beautiful the casting was. Hugh Dancy played the nervous, haunted, and unspooling protagonist. He's extremely sensitive, and unbeknownst to him, that sensitivity has landed him as the damsel in distress. On the other hand, we have Hannibal Lecter. He's cold, calculating, elegant, and impossible to read. While Hopkins' Lecter was operatic, Mickelson's Hannibal is restrained, and that restraint can be best described as terrifying. He's not a monster, but he is doing his best to be a man. Or rather, he is a man who has a monstrosity that he presents wrapped in politeness. Critics were floored by his performance and fans were obsessed with him, but that doesn't mean that the mainstream audience numbers would go high. When it came to Hannibal, there was nothing relaxing about it. You couldn't turn it on after a day at work and turn off your brain. No, it would get under your skin. It's slow, meditative, and baroque. You had to keep the subtitles on lest you miss some crucial details while sipping on wine. And this wasn't a show to watch while folding your laundry. And while this approach made the show beloved amongst all the critics and cinephiles, it was a tough sell for the average NBC viewer who wanted to relax in front of the TV. Despite that, NBC stuck it out. They aired 3 seasons, and that's way more than what Mindhunter got, but over the span of 3 seasons, Hannibal kept leaning more and more into its experimental psychological terrain, and by the 3rd season, it had completely abandoned the procedural structure that had tempted us to first watch it. There were no cases of the week, it was now just a straight-up horror fan fiction with hallucinations, poetic monologues, and of course, time jumps. Think about it this way. The 1st season, it was a gateway drug. The 3rd season, a full-on acid trip. Now, don't get me wrong, fans loved it, but others not as much. The frustrating truth of the whole thing is, Hannibal was always too good to live. This show had critical rave reviews every season. It had a 92% on Rotten Tomatoes for season 2. It was quite literally on Time and IndieWire's lists about TV shows that were the best of the decade. It even won Saturn Awards. It had a fandom that was tattooing quotes and creating symphonies for their murderer husbands. These fans were absolutely obsessed with Hannibal, but all of these good things don't change the fact that there weren't enough numbers to show. And that is the paradoxical nature of Hannibal. It was commercially limp while being critically beloved and celebrated. When it premiered, there were 4.4 million viewers on average. That might seem like a lot, but if you compare it to any other show, this 4.4 mil falls into the decent category. But by the time season 3 came around, the number of viewers had dropped drastically to around 1.3 million viewers. For a network TV show, that's a red flag, literally a siren screaming, "Cancel me." And to be fair, we all knew that Hannibal was never going to be a ratings racker. It wasn't a binge-worthy kind of show. It aired at 10 p.m. every Thursday, which is literally the graveyard shift, and was barely promoted when compared to other TV shows NBC had. In fact, the Chicago Fire spin-off got more hype than the finale of Hannibal, which was literally the most emotionally devastating and bloodiest episode on TV maybe ever. And of course, the whole piracy thing that fans often do hurts the numbers as well. According to entertainment.ie and other outlets, Hannibal was pirated a lot, like so much that Fuller even acknowledged that international fans of the show were forced to torrent the show because NBC was late with the global releases of it. So, wherever Hannibal aired late or didn't air at all, people turned to piracy. This built the fandom, yes, but it didn't pad the bottom line at all. NBC didn't see the pirated viewers as numbers, so in their eyes, Hannibal simply flatlined. So, while it would have made a lot of sense and hurt a lot less if Hannibal had been a flop, the truth was, it wasn't a flop at all. It had a lot of fans, it trended on Twitter, it had a buzz and had a dedicated fan base on both Twitter and Reddit. But this is only one side of the problem. There were other sides, like Hannibal confusing the mainstream audiences and the show scaring the NBC network. So let's unpack that first part. Given how much people like serial killers, the FBI, and a dark and sexy aesthetic, people would gobble up Hannibal as a whole, right? Well, the trailer kind of promised that whole thing. In the show, it was nothing like that. It wasn't like CSI with, let's say, fancier food. It wasn't like Dexter either. It was like a gothic romance where grief, trauma, and empathy were weaponized completely. The show was a love story with murder acting as the foreplay. For fans of the crime drama genre, this whole show felt a bit too abstract, and as for the art house fans, this show was way too gory for their taste. So the show practically ended in the no man's land. It was a prestigious horror, yes, but it was too radical for broadcast and too philosophical for a general audience. The mainstream audience expected to see a show where every week there would be a new killer and the cops would go after them, and sometimes 1 or 2 killers of the week would be a bit too grisly, but that was going to be it. However, things turned out a lot different when people actually tuned into the show. Instead of a general case of the week kind of thing, they got Will Graham basically going on a destructive descent with the help of Hannibal, who keeps staring at him like he would devour Will completely. Fuller's vision for the show can be best described as high concept. Every chapter was supposed to be a horror masterpiece. With the corpse placement and dense dialogue, it was truly out there. And NBC, well, they just didn't know what to do with Hannibal. To their credit, we have to admit that NBC did let Bryan Fuller get his way in a lot of aspects of the show. The gore in the show was far too much for network TV, but NBC allowed it. There were totem poles of bodies, victims who were turned into human angels, and blood fountains. All of that was aired completely uncut on the same network that gave us The Voice. It was miraculous that Hannibal was given this much wiggle room. However, despite the show being like the monster kid chugging Red Bull and Mountain Dew in the corner, who's somehow beloved by everyone in the family, NBC didn't accept all the quirkiness that the show came with. It never fully embraced the show, which made the whole thing thing a lot more complicated. The marketing was kept to a minimum. The promotions were extremely inconsistent. In fact, Bryan Fuller actually mentioned in quite a few interviews that he had to beg for more in all aspects. Support, money, time, you name it, and Bryan probably begged for it a lot. This series kind of got pushed around like that one soggy piece of broccoli you don't want to eat. NBC gave the show awkward slots and, for the most part, treated it like it was an experimental show when it deserved the love that flagship shows get. Blacklist and Grimm, two shows in the crime drama genre, got way more push from the network, while Hannibal was left to fend for itself. That lack of support is a crucial piece of this puzzle. You see, the lack of support reinforced the idea that the only people who watched Hannibal fell in the niche category, when in reality, the show always had the potential to go big and bring a lot of prestige. Like, think of Breaking Bad Season 3 or Fargo. Hannibal had every potential to reach that height of popularity and approval, but since NBC didn't back it up, Hannibal didn't get to see that kind of fame. As if that wasn't enough, then came the third season. This was a creative triumph, no doubt. I mean, the visuals were simply stunning, the plot was absolutely gripping, and the season literally drops the audience in the middle of the chaos. Hannibal is in Europe, running away from Will while doing his best Dracula impression. Sounds fantastic, doesn't it? However, there was a tiny issue. You see, the structure of this season was a complete gamble. You have so many flashbacks, and the pacing is, well, extremely experimental. The first half of the season feels so surreal that you'd think you're watching a fever dream play out in front of your eyes. But then, right at the mid-season mark, the show switches gears. The whole story starts with adapting Red Dragon, finally giving us the terrifying performance by Richard Armitage as Francis Dolarhyde. It feels like two different shows sewn together, and somehow it works perfectly. The aesthetic is brilliant and surreal, and Will's character arc is deeply mythic. And that's why we call Hannibal Fuller's masterpiece. However, when we turn towards the ratings, the third season was a bit of a disaster. The critics raved about the show, but the audience started dropping off. The third season somehow asked more from its viewers. The codes introduced in the third season would only make sense to you if you've been watching the show from the very beginning. The visual language this season displayed can only be understood and rightfully appreciated by Hannibal veterans. They weren't even pretending to be procedural, and by that point, NBC had given up on courting new viewers. It was abundantly clear that the days were numbered for this beloved program. Then, in June 2015, the hammer dropped. NBC announced that it wouldn't renew Hannibal for a fourth season. They stated the usual suspects as reasoning: low ratings, high production costs, and of course, limited advertiser appeal. But this felt like a huge betrayal for the fans. A lot of people felt that NBC pulled the plug, and pretty prematurely, might I add, on something that was rare, a once-in-a-generation kind of show, right before it hit its crescendo. The response to this news was as expected. The fans flooded social media with an apt hashtag, Save Hannibal, and there were petitions. There were pieces published. Fans even begged other streaming sites like Hulu, Netflix, and Amazon to pick the series up. Fuller teased ideas for season 4, claiming that it would be a reimagining of The Silence of the Lambs, but in a bold way. Rumors were flying, hopes were soaring. Even the leads, Mads Mikkelsen and Hugh Dancy, announced that they would return to the show in a heartbeat if they got the offer. Gillian Anderson was on board as well, and with so much news, the fandom was frothing at the mouth for the renewal. But sadly, nothing came of it. And the reason? Mostly legalities. The Silence of the Lambs rights, they were completely tied to MGM, so that meant there would be no Buffalo Bill, no Clarice Starling, and certainly no Chianti-laced Full Circle. Fuller managed to create the entire world of the TV show without evidently name-dropping these characters, effectively skirting around the legal minefield he was trapped in. But in the fourth season, it would be completely impossible to create it without all these important characters. Clarice would have been a new foil. This would have been the endgame for Hannibal. There would have been a full-on psychological war, and imagine watching all of that unfold with Fuller's beautiful cinematography. But MGM just wasn't ready to play ball, and the legal hurdles were far too high. The streaming platforms sniffed around for a while, hoping to maybe swoop in and earn some more money. However, they eventually backed off. The show is critically acclaimed, no doubt about that, but it was also expensive. The visual extravagance we see in the show isn't cheap. Sets, costumes, effects, everything that brought the show together all added up to inflate the budget. And since they didn't have the licensing rights to Silence of the Lambs, it just seemed way too expensive to put in the work. So the show got canceled. But it wasn't dead. Just like Hannibal, it was elegant, bruised, and waiting for a second chance in the shadows. Even if that second chance never came, Hannibal never died. The Fannibals stuck around. Tumblr posts shipping Will and Hannibal popped up everywhere. Reddit dove deep into the timeline breakdowns. TikTok showcased all these cool poetic edits of Hannibal scenes. Everyone knew this was a show that was legendary and deserved to be watched, and the fact that the show got cut added more to its legendary status. Now it's 2025 and the demand for the show hasn't gone away. Every 1 or 2 years, we get a new idea about season 4. The best part? The cast is still down. They're still ready. Mads and Hugh may play coy, but they've made it abundantly clear from their veiled statements that they're ready to come back whenever they get the offer. So now, we're left with a show that could have redefined what the horror genre can be on television. A show that blurred the lines between art, horror, and TV, giving us a network show that pushed all the boundaries. A show that died simply because it didn't fit the mold, but maybe that's the whole point. Hannibal was always designed with themes of transformation in it, so maybe that's the thing. The show was destined to transform instead of survive. And transform it did. In those 3 seasons, Hannibal went from that dark show on NBC to something that can be best described as a cultural landmark. It isn't a cult classic, it's a case study, almost a glimpse into the future of horror. It laid the very foundations that changed how we perceive horror as a genre. We would say that Hannibal kind of laid the foundation for all horror TV shows that followed it. Art and horror were no longer on opposite ends of the spectrum. Instead, they fed off of each other, creating a masterpiece. This is Hannibal's legacy. Now, you might think I'm joking, but let me prove to you that I'm not. Before Hannibal aired, horror on TV had 2 standard modes. Either it was like a slasher drama like The Following or American Horror Story, or it was akin to some procedural stuff like we see in Criminal Minds. Hannibal decided to think and step out of the box. It made horror look beautiful by turning the cannibal into a romantic anti-hero who was tragic, and every dead body in the show was shot like it was a piece of art, and every murder was a metaphor for something greater, like judgment or transformation. This is something we can see in modern horror TV shows like The Fall of the House of Usher, Servant, and Yellow Jackets. These shows aren't afraid of being weird or fragmented or deeply psychological while being artsy and stylish. Fuller paved the way for every other horror director to embrace the grotesque as visual poetry, to find the beauty in horror. If Hannibal didn't exist, the best we would have gotten would be Bates Motel, but since it does exist, we have directors like Ari Aster, Mike Flanagan, and a lot more, who've created a completely terrifying world filled with nightmares. And a big reason why this stylistic choice left such an impact on us was how Fuller decided to tell his story. He could have simply retold the story of Red Dragon, but instead of doing that, he reimagined the story through an awfully intimate and connected lens. We look at Hannibal Lecter in a much softer light. He seems more like a mirror showing us our own twisted longings instead of a monster. And Will, he's not a martyr who turned into an angel of death, he's a man who was seduced by his own darkness, something we think deep down we all relate to. There's a slow burn psychological story with romance and dead bodies. There was no subtext, it was right in your face, unapologetic and confident in itself. And this whole thing was an extremely bold move. I mean, we have 2 men circling each other for 3 whole seasons who share a connection that feels erotic, homicidal, romantic, and spiritual all at the same time. The show was far too queer for NBC and far too cerebral for the mainstream. This was too brutal to be a prestige show. And the cast, of course, was another marvelous pick. Mads Mikkelsen melted into the character and created a version of Hannibal Lecter that's significantly different from Anthony Hopkins' version. Mads' Hannibal is charming, inhumane, and elegant while being extremely sensual. He feels like a god amongst men, and we love it. Hugh Dancy's character, on the other hand, is like a revelation, an innocent soul being corrupted by darkness until it falls apart completely. This performance gets better every time you go back to the show. On top of that, we've got Gillian Anderson as Bedelia du Maurier, Lawrence Fishburne as Jack Crawford, and Carolina Daverna as Alana Bloom. That stacked cast really made horror history together. Everybody on the cast understood the assignment, and they ate, leaving no crumbs. Despite all of that, though, it wasn't enough to save the show. So let's talk about what could have been the season 4 that haunts all Fannibals. Bryan Fuller teased season 4 several times. He wanted to reimagine The Silence of the Lambs, not as a straightforward adaptation, mind you, more like a continuation of the Hannibal and Will saga that we've been following. He imagined Clarice as a trauma survivor who was changed by her past and eventually was drawn to Hannibal's orbit, feeling a sort of sympathy towards the man. Fuller wanted to show the softer side of Hannibal through Clarice, or perhaps he would see her as kin and not as prey. And of course, this was going to be dueled out psychologically. Will and Hannibal, in Bryan's mind, would resurface in each other's lives like ghosts after being presumed dead. He said that the 4th season would be the most experimental season ever. He wanted to step into Hannibal's mind completely. We'd get to see his dreams, prance around in his memory palace, and get a full-on metaphysical territory experience. This was going to be a full-on David Lynch experience, and it sounds fantastic. However, we'll never get to see it because MGM didn't want to take the risk. Back in 2015, prestige horror was not as popular as it is today, so the streaming platforms didn't show much enthusiasm, which made MGM think it wasn't worth it. And so, Fuller's plans remained trapped in limbo, with Will and Hannibal completely entangled with each other, mind, body, and soul. The cliffhanger we ended on surprisingly managed to crystallize the story. Will finally sees Hannibal for who he is and decides to embrace it. He falls from grace with him. He chooses to die with him, to become him. The plunge off the cliff feels less like a death scene and more like a wedding. The love story we'd been following for so long finally met its end with destruction. And then cut to black. Roll credits. This isn't closure. This is an invitation to dream about what can come next, and boy did the fans do that. The community never died. They did everything that all good cults do. Fan art, fan edits, fan fiction, video essays, all of that continues even to this day. You'll see petitions floating around. You can still find tweets begging streaming platforms to finally make season 4. Even to this day, people show up at conventions dressed as the Italian tailored cannibal. Because this is what Hannibal was. It was a show that transcended its own medium, and it lives in the imagination. It's not just a narrative, it's an experience that feeds off of obsession. It's a sensory overload. It was everything from slow, strange to sublime and even grotesque, but it did so proudly. In an industry that was obsessed with algorithms, Hannibal dared to be something else. It dared to be art. That's why it hurts so much that it got cut short. It was doing something new, and it proved that if we let shows like this breathe, TV can handle this kind of interesting show. I like to imagine that there's an alternate universe, a universe where Hannibal got 6 seasons. We see Clarice, we see a movie that follows The Silence of the Lambs. We learn what happened after the fall, the emotional consequences and the physical survival. We learn what it means to choose monstrosity, what it means to love someone who's a cannibal, what it's like to fall from grace and thrive in the darkness you fought so hard to keep at bay. But alas, we live in a universe where Hannibal was a masterpiece with just 3 acts. Even if it's incomplete, it somehow fits. It gives Hannibal a dreamlike quality, and that resonates with all the great tragic romances we've seen until now, because what could be more Hannibal-coded than simply watching beauty get cut short? Marvelous verdict! So, my dear viewers, if you ever find yourself wondering what happened to Hannibal, remember this. It was too artistic, too poetic, too queer, and too brutal for the machine that it was born from. It was aired on a network that didn't see its true potential. It chased ratings that it would never get. It was a show that defied everything a crime show was meant to be back in the day, and it paid the price for it. But despite all of that, Hannibal survived. It endured. It transformed. Through fans, through influence, through art, it was canceled, but never defeated. It didn't vanish, it simply evolved. It lingered in the back of the minds of many fans, like the aftertaste of a good wine or a perfectly cooked piece of liver. If justice exists, we believe Hannibal will come back one day. The television just wasn't ready for Hannibal back then, and it might not be ready for it right now either, but we are, and that's what matters. That's all we got for you this time, but if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Let us know what you guys think about Hannibal in the comments down below, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.